There's a story about a traveler who arrives at the gates of an ancient village where he meets a gatekeeper, this very old woman. And he has a conversation with her. They talk about the weather and his travelers and news from the distant lands that he's visited. But eventually, the traveler poses the all important question. He says, "What are the people like in this village?" And the old woman rubs her chin thoughtfully and then answers with a question of her own. She says, "Well, what are the people like in the village you just came from?" Oh, the man's face cracks wide open in a smile. "They were wonderful," he says. "They were hospitable and generous and kind and thoughtful in every possible way." And the woman too smiles in response and says that "I am pleased to tell you that you will find that the people of this village are much the same. They are hospitable, kind, generous, thoughtful in every possible way." She steps aside and the man enters into the village. And some time later, maybe days, maybe weeks, another traveler comes and meets the old woman sitting at the gate, and they have a conversation about the weather and his travelers and his travels and news from distant lands, until finally he asks the woman that all important question. He says, "What are the people like in this village that I'm entering?" And the old woman rubs her chin and asks her own question. She says, "Well, what were the people like in the last village that you visited?" And the man, his blood pressure begins to rise just thinking about it. He says, "They were awful. They were ill-tempered and ill-mannered and rude and boorish in every possible way." In the face of the old woman sitting at the gate, it falls. And she says, "Well, then I'm sorry to tell you that you will find that the people of this village are much, much the same. Ill-tempered, ill-mannered, boorish, and rude." And she steps aside and the man enters into the village. The reason I'm telling you this story is because I've been the traveler on both occasions. There are days that I wake up and I find that the people around me, they are wonderful. They are thoughtful and hospitable and kind and generous in every possible way. And there are different days that I wake up, or maybe even later in the same day, when I begin to wonder, how could I be stuck in the midst of such awful people who are ill-tempered and ill-mannered and boorish and rude? And in my more reflective moments, what I perhaps realize is that the problem isn't the villagers. The problem is the traveler. There was an ancient poet as well as an ancient storyteller, and the poet wrote these famous words. He said, "Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell together in unity. It is like precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robes. It is like the dew of Hermon which falls on the mountain of Zion. For there the Lord has commanded his blessing, life forevermore." Both the ancient storyteller and the ancient poet are expressing this truth that we know it is good and pleasant when brothers and sisters dwell together in unity. But I suspect that both of them, the storyteller and the poet, are reaching through this truth that we all know to point us to something even bigger. I think that they're trying to get us to grasp that our ability to live together in unity, in community, is a reflection of our individual health. Our ability to live together in community, or our inability to live together in community, is a reflection of our spiritual health. If this is the truth that both the poet and the storyteller are reaching towards, then they would find themselves in agreement with Jesus. You know that Jesus was once questioned, "What is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus, he didn't restrict it to one. Instead, he said there are two. That you are to love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And that Jesus, he stands in this scriptural stream, and he proclaims something that's there from beginning to end in the Bible, that we can't just ask, "How am I?" we also have to ask, how are we? We can't just ask, how am I? We also have to ask, how are we? Because our ability to dwell together in community, or our inability to dwell together in community, is the surest sign of our spiritual health. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke both include Jesus teaching his disciples how to pray. But it's John, perhaps, that gives us the most intimate glimpse of Jesus actually at prayer. And one of the most intimate glimpses of these intimate glimpses is in John chapter 17, where the cross looms large over the story. I mean, we are almost there. And with Jesus almost at the cross, he prays for an entire chapter, 26 verses. Half of it is for his disciples, the men right around him, and half of it is for the people who will believe because of the testimony of these disciples. And in that second half, for those who will believe because of the testimony of the disciples, Jesus prays this. He prays that they will believe in me through the words of the disciples, and then that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the whole world may believe that you have sent me. Jesus' prayer is that the disciples and their followers who believe because of their testimony, people like us, will all be one, so that the world will know that Jesus has been sent by the Father. There's this connection between our ability to live together in community, in unity, and our witness as a church. So that if the world looks at the church and it sees disunity and tension, it rightly says, I don't want any of that. I don't want any of what they have. But if the world looks at the church and sees community and unity, then it will believe that Jesus has been sent by the Father, because our ability to dwell together in community is as sure a sign as any of our spiritual health. This is nothing new. You could probably go to any church, anywhere, and find a sermon or an emphasis on unity. But I think where we often get confused is thinking about what exactly it is that we're supposed to be united around. What exactly is it that's supposed to hold us together? Because a lot of the time we reach for small and temporary and sometimes just strange things to hold us together. Before I came here to Melville, I was the youth pastor of a church in this historic neighborhood in Edmonton, in Old Strathcona. And if you visited that church where I was a youth pastor on any Sunday over the 80 to 90 years of its existence, you would have likely come away with the observation that this was a German church. That a lot of the people, most of the people, almost all of the people, they spoke German and thought German and ate German and were German. That they were bound together by this powerful experience of suffering and immigration and becoming established as families in a new land. This powerful thing that held them together. But is there something more? Is there something that can hold us together across these shared histories? Is there something that can hold us together when these histories are different or maybe even in tension with each other? Or you might think of the way that we do church, how we often divide things up so that there are groups gathered around particular interests. There's a Bible study for hockey players, or for young mums, or for youth, or for men, or for seniors. And so we divide up around these different groups. But is there something that can hold us together across these common interests or across these different histories that we have? If we can find that thing, that big thing that can hold us together across our differences, we will bear witness to the world in ways that we cannot now even begin to imagine. This doesn't mean that unity is easy. In fact, it is often very, very hard. And because it is very hard, we frequently find on the pages of the New Testament the churches struggling with exactly this. What holds us together across all of our differences? And one of the churches that struggled with that issue, what holds us together across all of our differences, was this collection of churches in Galatia. And Paul writes to them, and I want to turn to a part of what he's written in Galatians chapter 3. We're going to start in verse 7 and read to verse 14. Know then that it is those of faith who are the sons of Abraham. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you all the nations will be blessed. So then those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed be everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law, and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith, rather the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. Now, you could be forgiven for thinking that the introduction of this sermon was all about unity, and then I read a passage that seems to have nothing to do with unity. On first glance, at least, this passage seems to be about faith. The word is mentioned at the beginning and at the end of the passage, and 4 times in between, sometimes with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. This passage is about faith. In particular, it's about the faith of Abraham. And there's a reason why it's about the faith of Abraham. You see, in the first century, most of the Jews of the time would have looked at Abraham as an example of obedience. In fact, there are some of them who would have said that Abraham was so remarkable in his obedience that he obeyed the law that God would give even before God gave it. Abraham is exemplary in his obedience. And there's something there that's right. Abraham was exemplary in his obedience. He went to the land that God showed him. When God gave him the command of circumcision, he did it. Abraham was obedient. But Paul holds up this giant of the biblical story, and he says, let's look at him again, because there's something there that you're not seeing. What is it that makes Abraham a giant of the biblical story? Well, the first book of the Bible is Genesis, of course, and the first 11 chapters of Genesis you will find are somewhat different than anything you will find anywhere else in the Bible. But as you read through those chapters, you will surely notice that they have a particular trajectory. The story is moving in a particular direction. What I mean by that is that the story begins with God creating and saying over and over again, it is good, it is good, it is good. And by the time we get to Genesis chapter 11, we wonder very honestly if there's any of that goodness left. The story begins with God enjoying intimacy with the man and woman he created in the garden where he has placed them, and it ends with God coming down to scatter men and women across the face of the earth. The story begins with blessing and it ends in tragedy. It's got a particular trajectory to it. But alongside the movement, the downward movement of the story, you will surely notice as well that there are these moments where God breaks in, where the story might seem like it's going in the wrong direction, but God, he just steps in with his grace and his mercy, and he lifts the whole thing up again. So at the very beginning, the man and the woman, they sin. They decide to eat of the tree of which they are not supposed to eat. And God steps in judgment. He exiles them from the garden. He sends them out, but it's not only judgment, God also gives them grace. He clothes the naked man and the naked woman. And he gives them this promise that one will come who will crush the head of the serpent. So there's this new grace stepping into the story. Or there's the sons of the first man and woman, Cain and Abel. And Cain rises up and he kills his brother. And God steps in judgment. He says that Cain is to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, but he also gives Cain this grace. He also lifts the story up. And so God says to Cain that his hand of protection will be on him, that nobody will kill him, that he enjoys the protection of God, this murderer does. And so on we could go, seeing God step into the story at these moments and offering his grace. So we know that the story may be going downward and looking really, really bleak. God is not distant, that he is still involved, he's still at work, he's still seeking to restore everything that has been lost. And that's where Abraham steps into the story. God is not distant, he is still seeking to restore everything that has been lost. And that's why the Bible, from Genesis chapter 12 on into the New Testament, is about Abraham's family. Because God is working grace in and through Abraham that is to be for the whole world. That's why he's a big deal. And that's why Paul holds him up here in Galatians and says, let's pay attention to the story and the order in which things happened. And if we're paying attention to the story, then we'll notice that we're introduced to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And when we're introduced to Abraham, God just pours this promise out over him. Before we know that Abraham has done anything, God gives him this promise. Paul would say the next key moment in the story of Abraham comes only a few chapters later in Genesis chapter 15, where God speaks the promise out again. And this time we're told that Abraham believes God and that belief is counted to him as righteousness. Paul says, hey, this is really, really important. That Abraham is not remarkable because of his obedience. He's remarkable because of his belief, because of his faith. And that before any grand obedience happened, God reckons Abraham's faith, his belief, as righteousness. This is what Paul is saying then to the Galatians, that the story has always been about faith. It's always faith that has allowed people to enter into what God is doing. Now, the reason he has to say that is because there's this segment in the Galatian church that wants to pull the church onto a different path, where it becomes about the law. And Paul says that anybody who chooses the law will be under a curse. The way that has often been understood is that the law is God's standard, and it is way up there. And if we can achieve the standard, then there is the promise of blessing. But if we try for the standard and miss, then there is the assurance of curses for disobedience. And because nobody will ever reach the standard, if we choose the law, we will always receive curses rather than blessings. And there may be something in there that's just about right. But there's a couple of things that we should remember. The first thing that we should remember is that the law never commands or never expects to be perfectly obeyed. That's why within the law, there are all these provisions for if you sin, then you do this. This is how you become reconciled to God and make amends with the neighbor that you've sinned against. So the law doesn't expect or demand perfect obedience. Next, we should remember that no Jew in Paul's day would have said that the law demands perfect obedience. Instead, what they would have said is you should be thoroughly obedient to the law. And when you fail, when you sin, then do what is necessary to be reconciled to God through the system of sacrifice and to be reconciled to the neighbors that you have sinned against. Finally, we should remember that Paul never speaks of the law as an impossible standard to reach. Actually, in the book of Philippians, when he tells his own biography, he says, as to righteousness under the law, I was blameless. So Paul isn't saying here in Galatians that the law is a standard that can never be reached. Instead, he's telling a church that they have mispurposed the law, that they are using it for something that it was never intended to be used for. They're using it to win God's favor, but more than that, they're using it to draw this boundary marker around the people of God. The people of God are the people who do the law. And Paul says, no, look at the story. Look back to Abraham and how it begins. The people of God are people of faith. That's always the way it's been. In The West Wing, this television drama, there was a scene where the president, Jeb Bartlett, has to figure out whether a group of refugees are really refugees or whether they're running a con. And central to figuring this out, he has to determine whether they're Christians or not. And so he tells his advisors, the president does, that he's going to try to get them to say Shibboleth. He's referring to this story in the Bible where there's a civil war in Israel. And the way that one side recognizes its enemies is by making them say Shibboleth, or try to say it because they can't. They say Sibboleth. The president in the story, he's looking for this marker, this evidence that these people really are the Christians that they claim to be. So he takes one of their representatives and he asks them about who the 12 apostles are and what the greatest commandment is and what the 10 commandments are. And on every question, the man answers the president accurately. And then finally, the refugee says to the president, "Mr. President, I think you're looking for a shibboleth. And the true shibboleth," he says, "is faith." He's right. The true shibboleth is faith. What marks the boundary of the people of God is not obedience to the law. It's not history or culture or tradition. It's faith in the Son of God who died for us and lives again so that we can have new life. The true shibboleth has always been faith. And that's what holds the church together across these myriad of differences. Scott McKnight says of this that it's kind of like cooking. He says there are 3 ways to make a salad. There's the American way, there's the weird way, and then there's the right way. He says the American way is to take some iceberg lettuce and some vegetables and cover them with so much ranch dressing that that's all you taste. He says that the weird way is to divide the vegetables up on the plate so that you have cucumbers over here and maybe peppers here and tomatoes over here. He says the right way is to take fresh produce, maybe some arugula, maybe some spinach, maybe some things that you don't think belong in a salad like citrus fruit and nuts and goat cheese, and toss them all together with just enough oil to bring out the flavor of each. And you see, sometimes we do church the American way. There is a little bit of difference in the church, but we drench it in so much of the same culture, the same language, the same way of thinking, the same way of dressing, the same way of acting, and that everything just becomes sort of gray. And sometimes we do church the weird way. We put this group of people over here, and this group of people over here, and this group of people over there. But sometimes we do church the right way. We take people who are incredibly diverse and different, and we welcome them in. And we continue to be diverse and different, held together by faith in Jesus, who loved us enough to die for us and lives again so that we can have new life. We let faith hold us together across our differences. And then the church, it's full of rich and poor, and college educated and barely educated, and families and empty nesters and widows and widowers, and young and old, and all the colors and cultures of the world that are precious in Jesus' sight. That's the way the church is supposed to be. And if the church is ever going to be that, then we need to do mission like that. And I don't mean mission far away and somewhere else for somebody else. I mean the mission that we do right here at home. When I was 18 years old, I got the best earthly invitation I have ever received. The girl who became my wife asked me to spend Christmas at her family's place. I was so nervous. I could barely eat in front of them. I forgot the only 8 words of German that I knew. I felt like this oddball. But what made it easier is I wasn't the only oddball there. It seemed that oddballs were welcome around my future in-laws' table. At Christmas time, it was this recovering alcoholic who loved to play board games, in particular Sorry, just because my father-in-law didn't like to play Sorry. At Easter, it was this man that we stopped to pick up at a bus stop on the way to church who crammed his way in beside me in the back seat of the family's Renault Clio and jabbered away with all the pent-up words of too many days alone. And when we dropped him off after church, my mother-in-law turned around and kind of half apologetically to me said, "These people just seem to find their way to me." She didn't need to apologize. There was nothing to apologize for. It was something that was beautiful. That people who were invisible to others were visible to my mother-in-law because she remembered what it was like to be lost and found and stand before God only because of faith and His grace. And she saw the people that no one else saw, and she welcomed them in. That's church the right way. That's church the way it's supposed to be. So brothers and sisters, go and be the church.